tonight on Training Camp News. Contract drama, coach speak, backfield shakeups, and a surprise retirement, plus the third installment of the Brandon Aiyuk saga. And, most importantly, what does all this mean for your fantasy drafts? All this and more on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome back to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. If it's the first time joining us, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also hit us up on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, where I answer all of your DMs, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O, and our website where I store all my rankings is ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my articles at rasball.com. Now, today we're talking about training camp news, and I'm going to be taking you through all the latest news around the NFL, and we're going to be discussing the fantasy impact. If you haven't already, you can also check out my earlier off-season news articles. Plus, I just released all of my positional redraft rankings as well, so feel free to check those out too. Let's start things off with the Texans and CJ Stroud saying he definitely wants to attack down the field more this year. And realistically, Stroud was one of the most accurate downfield passes, but he was a little bit passive in this regard, and they could afford to be a little bit more aggressive downfield. I feel like bringing Stephon Diggs in is certainly going to bring more attention to the middle of the field and could mean we see a lot more of Nico Collins and Tank Dell getting quite deep. This is technically good news for CJ Stroud and also for Collins and Dell. Not so sure about Diggs. I'm not sure really that he's at that age where he can really have that burst to get downfield, but realistically, it's only really giving these guys a very small bump for me, not even moving them in my rankings. It's just kind of a thing to file away and go, oh, that's a positive thing. But it's the kind of thing that teams say early in the year and that quarterbacks say, oh, we're going to try to do more of this thing. Very rarely actually happens. So, I mean, it's positive compared to the alternatives, but realistically to me, file this away as, doesn't really mean too much. Meanwhile, confirmation, Sam Darnold will receive the majority of first-team reps in training camp. And to that I say, well, obviously, we know he's going to be the starter. That's been the case for quite some time. If you watch my previous off-season news articles, you'd have seen that that's been the case for quite a long time. We know J.J. McCarthy is going to sit behind him unless something surprising happens in camp. Now, realistically, McCarthy might take over at some stage, but to me, Darnold is a solid super flex option. And realistically, in certain leagues, he might even be good in the first couple of weeks, depending on how the matchups end up looking and how he looks in training camp. I think realistically, I'm just going to stay away from both Darnold and McCarthy. But if I'm in a super flex league, I'm kind of running out of options. Darnold's someone I might consider, but this news specifically doesn't really change much because we already knew that this was going to be the case. Another thing that doesn't change too much is Jordan Love not practicing until he receives a contract extension. I mean, I think we can all see that this is probably coming. I think this has been coming for a while. I would expect that he's definitely going to get one in the near future, and this should have no impact on his chances of playing this season and shouldn't have much impact on his actual play either. Now, let's move to the running backs. And it's all about Joe Mixon in Texans training camp. A lot of Texans news coming out recently. So Bobby Slovic, who's their offensive coordinator, has been talking about Joe Mixon as an absolute workhorse in every regard. But then D'Amico Ryans, who's the head coach, came out and said, well, Joe Mixon and Dameon Pierce will be a 1-2 punch. It just feels like the kind of thing that a coach would say just to give a bit of a pep up to Pierce. But then again, Slovic's comments as well are probably also the same thing. And the Texans also signed Cam Akers, which doesn't mean very much at this stage in his career. Akers has lost a lot of burst due to those injuries. He's purely a bench option. Oops, I made a bad error there. I forgot to change Jordan Love's name to Joe Mixon. That's fixed up. So Joe Mixon, realistically, I mean, we knew this was going to be his role anyway. We know he's going to be the main guy. Dameon Pierce is going to be the backup. I don't think any of this coach speak tells us otherwise. They're just talking up plays for the sake of it. So neither of these guys move around in my rankings too much. Now, Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears are apparently both starting players, according to Brian Callahan. Realistically, this is kind of bad news for both of them. Not very bad news because we kind of thought it was going to be a split, but ideally you want him to say something like, this is a training camp battle where one of them could potentially win out. or something like, oh, we're still looking to see what happens, or alternatively, him coming out and saying, no, what, this guy is our starter. You don't want a situation where both players are going to be starting players. That's never good news for fantasy. You want a backfield where your guy is the guy. And in this case, because we're still going into drafts, we don't care who it is. We just need someone to be the starter. And it looks like it's going to be neither of them at this stage. And that's bad news for both. Kind of expected news, to be fair, but I thought there was a chance that Pollard would get the starting job. I also thought it was possible, at least, that Pollard would look bad in camp and then Spears would take it over. So this is bad for Pollard. It's more neutral for Spears, but probably still bad for him because even if they said it was a training camp battle, there's a chance he at least wins out. I don't know. It's not massive news, but I did drop them both a little bit because it's just not what you want to hear for fantasy players. Now, Marshall Lloyd should have an early impact, but won't be the starter. I mean, yeah, I think we kind of expected this. It's better than hearing the opposite, which is that he's in a battle with AJ Dillon or he's behind AJ Dillon. I mean, we are hearing that AJ Dillon is looking very fit at the moment, and that's great. And I'm sure great for his Instagram account, but realistically, he's probably done as it goes being a fantasy option at the moment. It's probably going to be Josh Jacobs being the main guy, then Marshall Lloyd, then AJ Dillon. It doesn't affect Jacobs much. They're talking about Lloyd making an impact, but we knew this was going to have a little bit of a split. That's how they do things in Green Bay. But Jacobs is still going to be the main guy, and Marshall Lloyd is going to be the backup, who has a little bit of an impact but doesn't do too much. So Lloyd moves a little bit up in my rankings. This also moves AJ Dillon down a little bit, but this isn't really particularly surprising. It's just a slight bump for Lloyd. Now, Gus Edwards is the lead back for the Chargers, with J.K. Dobbins likely being the primary backup. And to that I say, yeah, we thought that was going to be the case. I've been saying that for a while. That's where the money's going. He's clearly the more accomplished back at this stage. I know J.K. Dobbins had very good draft capital early, and he looked solid for a while, but he's had so many injuries, we don't even know if he's the same back that he used to be. I know a lot of people are talking about Kamani Vidal. He's a 6th-round pick. He's more of a special teams guy, if anything. It wouldn't even surprise me if he barely makes the roster. I know we're getting excited about any Chargers running back because we expect this to be run heavy, but Gus Edwards is the guy you want here. I do think that this whole situation is going to be messy, but Gus Edwards is going to be the main guy. J.K. Dobbins takes a little bit of a dip for me. Kamani Vidal I already had pretty low, but he takes a bit more of a dip for me as well because he wasn't even mentioned in this situation. It's also worth mentioning, by the way, this is more speculation than anything else, but I do think it's slightly more informed speculation than we see in a lot of these articles. I think this is informed by what they're actually saying. And for that reason, I do like what it means for Edwards, even though it's kind of what I already assumed. It's at least a little bit of confirmation there. Now, this is bad. Dennis Allen coming out and talking about Kendre Miller, saying he needs to be more consistent and he needs to figure out how to stay healthy if he's going to make the team. Miller currently has a hamstring injury, of course had a serious injury, not a serious injury, but an injury at the start of last season as well, has struggled to stay on the field, has struggled to look good consistently at training camp and during the season as well. There's just a lot of dings coming out of coaches. This is not what you want to hear. There are a lot of situations where coaches will say nice things about players regardless of whether they deserve it. This is Allen going out of his way to say negative things about Miller. That rarely means something good. It could mean he's giving him a kick up the butt, but it certainly means Miller drops for me. There was a little bit of buzz behind Miller with Kamara sitting out potentially and Jamal Williams getting older and not very efficient last year. But I think that was just Williams not playing well because of the situation he was put in. He was first forced to do a lot of early down work. And I think you're always going to look bad when you do early down work. I still think that Williams is the main backup. You'll see a little bit more Miller if Kamara goes down, but realistically, it's at best a committee. You don't want either of these guys particularly, but if you're going to take one of them, can't prefer Williams in redraft. Though in redraft, both of them are horrible. And Miller at least has some upside long-term because he could get it all together, but it's looking bad for this whole situation outside Kamara, honestly. Now, this is a really interesting one, and this is one I didn't expect at all. I've been pretty high on Clyde Edwards-Helaire. I was a big fan of him in college, for those who have been following me for a little while. I had him in my college fantasy team, so I used to watch a lot of LSU games. He was fantastic, very solid receiving back, got a surprising amount of goal line carries for guys quite small. So I was disappointed that he didn't turn out properly for the Chiefs, but I thought he was at least going to be the clear backup here. That seemed to be what they were doing. Jarek McKinnon's gone. They haven't really brought in any true actual threats. I felt like it was probably going to be Isaiah Pacheco being the main starter, and then Clyde Edwards-Helaire is the clear backup. That's not what we're hearing. We're hearing that Deneric Prince took the first team reps, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire was there with my rugby guy from Wales, Louis Rees-Zammit. I mean, we're Aussie. We just take anyone who plays rugby basically as our own. Look, those guys are taking second team reps. That's not a great sign early in training camp. You'd think in training camp, at least, the vets are going to get the better touches. So the fact that Prince, who isn't exactly an accomplished player, is getting first team reps means something. We don't know exactly what it means, but it's not a good sign. So I've moved CEH down. I've still got him ahead of Prince. This just feels weird to me. I didn't really see a clear number 3 there, and it seems to clearly be Prince now, so he takes a big jump, but I can't move him ahead of Clyde Edwards-Helaire based on a couple of training sessions. I feel like I need to know a little bit more. It could be injury-related, could be a punishment for something, rather maybe he turned up a little bit unfit or something like that. So there are reasons this could have happened, but in a really deep dynasty league, if you're relying on Chiefs backups, I think there's a reason to get Prince later on. I just got him very late in a 32-team league, and he's great value there. But you need a pretty deep league before realistically wanting either of these guys. I took both in that league simply because it's very deep rosters. But for the most part, I'd just be avoiding this situation altogether. Now, this is an interesting one, and I can't spell Andre, apparently. This is an interesting one. Both Chase Brown and Audrey Joseph have been making the fastest improvement of any players he's ever seen. This is from their private receiver coach. This is not their team coach. So it doesn't mean very much at all. It's just kind of people saying stuff. Of course, he's going to be revving up the players that are paying him money to use him. This isn't surprising at all. So this doesn't mean anything. This means literally nothing. It's nice for these guys, but it means literally nothing. Maybe you could argue it's a positive that they're at least hiring a private receiver coach, but him saying this wasn't that piece of information. We could have worked that out if we wanted to. A lot of players will do that. It's good that Chase Brown wants to improve receiving back. I do think Joseph has a chance to be that number 3 guy. I know that Walt from Water Football, I go on their podcast quite a lot. He's a big fan of Joseph. He thinks he's going to play ahead of Jermaine Burton. And he's a big college guy, and he's got his finger in a lot of pies. Cincinnati's one of them. So that means something to me. I do think Joseph could be useful here, but I think Burton's probably still the main guy. This news specifically, though, has no impact on anything to do with either of these guys. Let's talk about more wide receiver stuff. Sidney Lamb not reporting to training camp. Was the initial news. We're seeing a lot of players not reporting to training camp or holding in. They're reporting but not training. It's not good news, but they're going to get something done here. They're not just going to not sign him to a new contract. I know Justin Jefferson got a new contract, but CeeDee Lamb's been really good as well. It's hard to look good when you compare to Jefferson, but Lamb's been fantastic. He's been one of the best players in football. The fact that he and Jefferson just happen to be in the same class and therefore are getting extensions at the same time is kind of bad luck because he doesn't look as shiny by comparison, but he's a fantastic player. I do think that Lamb, for me, is still number 1 in both fantasy situations because he's got that better quarterback, but it does make you a little bit nervous, particularly in Dynasty, that he could potentially be going somewhere else in the next couple of years. That would be bad for his value. So he's still the number 1 for both in me, but he's a lot further down in Dynasty than he was. This doesn't make too much difference in redraft because I can't imagine he's actually going to sit out any games. Rashad Bateman is expected to be a top receiver in the league for us. Now, this is obviously a delusional comment. The Ravens aren't going to have a top receiver in the league. That's just not the case. And if it's going to be someone, it's going to be Zay Flowers. This is just coach speak. But at least he's choosing to talk about Rashad Bateman. He could talk about a lot of different players. He's gone out of his way to talk about Bateman. Bateman, arguably their number 2 player, ahead of Walker at the moment and also ahead of Aguilar. I do kind of like him. I don't think I moved him very far in my rankings. I think I may have moved him a spot or 2 because this feels like at least positive news, but it doesn't mean very much. And I certainly wouldn't be going out of my way to get Bateman. He's more of a deep league guy. If you're in like a 14-team league or a league that drafts a lot of wide receivers, there's a bit of upside here. But when Lamar Jackson is your quarterback, that's really good news. Now, this one is interesting to me. The Panthers will feature Deontay Johnson. That's according to his head coach, Dave Canales. Now, what that means, we don't exactly know. We know they're going to be very run heavy. They've basically come out and said that running the ball is going to be the key to what they're doing early on. But we know that Deontay Johnson can be a massive target hog. And for that reason, this kind of makes sense. But I'm still moving him up because this is positive news. He's basically going out of his way to say, yeah, this is our number 1 receiver. And you love to hear that. from the head coach. This isn't so much them saying, oh, he's just looking good. This is actually talking about his role. And that's good news. And that's what we want to be hearing from training camp, something definitive like this about the role of the player. And that's why I've moved Johnson up. I think he moved 3 spots up in my redraft rankings, a little bit up in Dynasty as well. I still thought he was going to be the number 1, but there was always the possibility that Adam Thielen was going to be good. There was the possibility Xavier Legette would come in and just look spectacular. And I guess that could still happen. I do like Legette long-term, but I do think, especially with Bryce Young, it's going to be hard for him to look good initially. So Johnson's the guy you want. He's going to get a lot of targets. And in PPR, he's going to get even more. My Dynasty rankings are PPR and my redraft rankings are half PPR, which is a bit inconvenient, but it's just the standard for Fantasy Pros. And as you guys know from my award stuff, I do everything through Fantasy Pros and their app-led. So if you're wondering why that's happening, that's the reason behind that. So I do like Johnson. He moves up for me. He's someone I'm interested in getting late on in drafts. He's not going to be a league winner, but he could at least be valuable to you. Boron Brandon Aiyuk. This guy could not stay out of the news, and kind of by design, he definitively wants a new contract. I don't think he actually wants to get out of town. He's just playing that card. So he's officially requested a trade from the 49ers, but he has reported to training camp. I believe he's holding in. This isn't surprising at all. We kind of thought this was going to happen. We kind of thought he was going to keep playing these games trying to get a contract, but realistically, I don't think he's going to get one. I don't think it makes sense. I think he expects to play for the 49ers this year and then move on after that. So I think he's playing the card, seeing what will happen. But I think eventually they're just going to say, no, it's not going to happen. I don't think he's going to hold out for the season. For that reason, I haven't really dinged him too much. But the more I talk about it, the more I am kind of like, could he hold out? I don't think so. I don't think it makes sense. I do think a trade's possible. Trade would be bad, but I've already kind of baked that into his dynasty value. I do expect that he probably goes somewhere else next year, and that looks bad for him. So that's why I've got him lower in dynasty. That, in the fact, he's a bit older than some of the young guys. But I still think in redraft, he's going to be a solid option. Now, Chris Godwin going to be used in the slot more this year, kind of in that Cooper Kupp role. I mean, this is mainly speculation, but I've heard it from a lot of different places. And for that reason, I put a little bit more weight in it, and I do like it. I think it's a very good thing for Godwin. We saw when he played a lot in the slot. This is a guy who was like the wide receiver 2, overall, like the wide receiver 2, the second highest scoring player in fantasy, 5 years ago, 2019, something like that. So he could be very good this year. The problem is Mike Evans is the main guy, so he's the number 2 option, and Rashad White's going to get a lot of touches, and it's not going to be the greatest offense. Baker Mayfield, I think, probably takes a slight step back for fantasy, but he could still be pretty good. I know this is positive for Godwin, but it's hard to feel like we did a couple of years about him, but he kind of has more upside than a lot of guys in that range where you're getting him. I do feel like he looked like he was lacking a bit of burst last year, and that scares me a little bit, but this is still positive news. I do like this, even though it's not definitively what's going to happen. There's not the coach coming out and saying, this is how we're going to use this player. It's just kind of speculation based on what people are seeing. Now, this was a little bit of surprise, though not particularly worrying from a fantasy perspective, more so from a personal perspective. Michael Gallup has retired. I don't really know why. I don't think anyone really knows why. He hasn't really come out and said, to my knowledge, to this point anyway. Look, I hope he's okay. Hope he's doing fine. I hope he's just happy to move on and try different things. He has had a lot of injuries that have really meant he wasn't the player he used to be. And I think maybe you just saw the writing on the wall. I hope that's the case, and that it's not something more serious or something more concerning. Regardless, this is good news for Trey Tucker. It's not fantastic news because I already had Tucker ahead of Gallup, but I thought there might be a little bit of a committee situation where Gallup comes in and does some deeper stuff, and then Tucker does a lot of the slot work when Adams isn't there. I still think that we're going to see a lot of Bowers and Meyer on the field at the same time, and that hurts Tucker, and that's why he's not ranked higher. But this is at least really positive for Tucker. He's the clear number 3 at the moment. I'm not really worried about Jalen Guyton and guys like that coming in and taking touches. This is Tucker's number 3 role. It's just that the number 3 role in this offense isn't worth that much. Now, everyone's heard this one. Jordan Addison was arrested on suspicion of a DUI. This typically would be a 1-game suspension, but we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens. This is bad news. It's not terrible news, but it's bad news. This is the second time he's had a driving offense, and he hasn't even been in the league for more than a year. So it's kind of crazy. It's kind of stupid that players keep doing this stuff, but this isn't soapbox time. We're talking fantasy. I think in fantasy, it's a bit of a ding for him. I already thought he was going to have a bad season. I think that realistically he shouldn't miss more than one game. We haven't really heard anything that sounded particularly bad about this. It's not like he was actually caught driving. I believe he was sleeping in the car under the influence when they caught him. So it is possible he gets no suspension at all, though I think he possibly gets a small one either this year or next. My biggest concern here is I just think the number 2 wide receiver in this offense isn't going to be worth very much. And for that reason, I was already low on him. This just gives him another little ding. I think it moves him down maybe a spot. Jalen Polk has the chance to be the Patriots' number 1 in the season opener. I kind of thought that was the case already. It kind of makes sense looking at the tea leaves. Kendrick Bourne is still recovering from a serious injury. Pop Douglas is just the slot guy. I know there's a lot of people talking about him. I'm not interested at all. I think that Polk's the main guy. He's a talented player. He was taken very early in the second round. I think he is going to be very good. The concern here is the quarterback play. As much as people are talking up Jacoby Brissett and how professional he is, I don't want a professional player. I want a talented, good player. I mean, I do want a professional player as well, but that's not the number one thing I want out of my quarterback. I want one who's talented and going to run the offense well. I don't know that that's Brissett. I don't think that Drake May coming in is going to make a massively positive impact for Polk initially. I think that long-term he could be very good, but at the moment I'm a little bit concerned about the whole offense, and for that reason, he's my top Pats wide receiver, but he's not that much higher than the other guys. Tim Patrick is on the roster bubble. And to that I say, well, yeah, obviously, he's the 5th guy. I love Tim Patrick for a number of years, but he's had a lot of injuries. He hasn't played in like 3 years. And he looked solid before that. But, I mean, there's no reason to have him for fantasy. I just can't see a situation where he gets past all of or enough of Cortland Sutton, Marvin Mims, Troy Franklin, Josh Reynolds. All of those guys are obviously ahead of him. It's not like Patrick is a particularly good special teamer. I just don't think there's a clear role for him. I think that realistically it is going to be hard for him to make the roster. And if he does, he's going to be kind of like that extra experienced veteran receiver. I've kind of already got that. I've already got a bit of experience in Sutton and Reynolds. So I don't know that they need that guy on the roster. He's someone you can drop in pretty much every fantasy league. Now, apparently, DJ Chark's going to play ahead of Quentin Johnston. Don't know that this really means a lot to me. I don't really trust this report. I think that this is going to be a committee. I don't think it makes sense to suggest that Chark's going to be out there all the time. He wasn't out there all the time last year. Why is he suddenly going to go to the Chargers, who don't particularly want to throw the ball deep a lot anyway, and suddenly they're going to put a deep threat out there on every player? It just doesn't make sense to me. So for that reason, I'm not buying this news at all. I haven't moved either of these guys. I'm not interested in either of them. I'm not interested in the Chargers passing offense. Maybe Lab McConkey a little bit. For the most part, this whole situation's ugly. I do think Johnston has the capacity to turn it around, but Chark's not someone I want anything to do with at all. The Vikings have placed TJ Hawkinson on the active pup list, but according to Kevin O'Connell, he's well ahead of schedule. I mean, that's good, but I still think that you're going to miss him for nearly half the season. And for that reason, I'm not particularly interested in redraft. There are situations where I'll happily take players in that situation, but this kind of situation where even when he comes back, he might struggle. This whole offense is likely to struggle. I just don't particularly want Hawkinson. I do want him in Dynasty. I think in the next year or two, he could be fantastic. But this year for redraft, not particularly interested at all. And the last one, we have kicker news, which is rare for us here. But, I mean, we are getting into actual draft season. Some people are going to draft kickers. I would recommend you don't. You should either remove them from the league entirely, or you should not draft them yet, not draft a kicker at all, and then, 3 or 4 days out from the season, that's when you go and you pick up your kicker, because you can have someone else who's going to have a little bit more upside and potentially grow into a role, and you can know who to drop a couple of days out from the season. Either way, Dustin Hopkins has signed a 3-year, $15.9 million contract extension. Gosh, kickers getting pretty solid money, even if they're kind of average. Now, to be fair, I think Hopkins kicked 33 from 36 or something like that for field goals last year, and he was pretty good for fantasy. He was top 10, but they weren't particularly high scoring. It was mostly like that sort of production tends to be fluky year to year field goal production. I have had years where I've been ranked very, very high in kicker rankings, and I even don't really know the best way to predict them. It's just random, basically. You just got to get lucky. So I wouldn't be going out of my way to get Hopkins. Not a high-scoring offense. Maybe he gets a lot of field goals, but maybe he's totally useless. So, I mean, this is positive for him. Congratulations. But I don't think he's someone that I particularly want in fantasy. Lastly, if you've got your redraft drafts coming up or even a dynasty draft and you're doing those a little bit late, hit me up. I'd love to help you out. Most of the rankings you'll find online are for very specific league settings that aren't yours. They don't know what your league is, and they definitely didn't set up their rankings that way. The rankings are nearly always set up generically. In fact, a lot of us, if you're doing something like Fantasy Pros and using their applet, we don't even rank across positions. That's just done randomly by Fantasy Pros. So most of the positional rankings are pretty good across the internet, and I rank mine highly, obviously. Top 10 4 straight seasons. But I do think that if you're trying to compare when you should take a wide receiver to a running back, very difficult to find online advice there. And I would highly recommend that you seek out something a little bit more specific to your league. And that's where I'm here to help. I've been doing this for a couple of years now. Basically, I'll take your league settings. I've got a special program I put it into that'll take my rankings in your league settings and use value-based drafting to work out when you should take those guys. I'll also give you a heap of draft tips as well to help you out with your league. Had really good results. A lot of people talked about how it really helped them in their league, and they were a competitive team for the first time in a while. A lot of people winning, which was super exciting. So I'd love you to join that crew. It's very low price, only $10. If you've got really weird league settings, it can be a little bit more, but for the most part, just $10. So hit us up on email, benwasley23@gmail.com. Now, in addition, if you missed it to start with, please make sure you check out our website, ffdfantasyfootball.com. That is getting redone at the moment, by the way, and it's going to look bigger and better, mainly better, within the coming months. Obviously, like and subscribe on YouTube, please. That really helps us out. We're trying to, at some stage, monetize potentially, so I can do this a little bit more. This is very much a hobby for me at the moment, even though I do a lot of work on this stuff. So your support's always appreciated. You can find me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. That's where I put all my rankings first. So if you want the rankings when they first come out, that's a good place to go. I'm on Twitter. I'm at Fantasy First Down with no O. That's where I put a lot of my announcements and stuff. So you're interested in that sort of thing. And I also share a lot of stuff from the guys I work with who put out some really good content too. And finally, my articles, football.rasball.com. They've got some amazing tools as well that you can use. I would definitely recommend potentially even subscribing there. It's very inexpensive, and you get some amazing stuff that you wouldn't get otherwise. They have, I think, arguably the best tools on the internet for a lot of fantasy football stuff. So definitely go and check it out. Could not recommend that highly enough. Meanwhile, I'll be back in the next few days with more fantasy football content. I look forward to you speaking to you then. And remember, I will be doing these training camp news things every week or two, just making sure we're staying up to date and telling you what you need to know around the fantasy landscape. I will see you guys next time.